As teenagers, Cain and Abel were walking with their father Adam through the hot sands in search of water when the sons noticed this beautiful walled garden, just lush and so different from the desert area they're trudging through. And they said, "Dad, look, what's that?" He says, "Oh, that's Eden." He said, "Oh, can we go there?" He said, "No, it's closed. That's where your mother ate us out of house and home." Indeed, Adam and Eve were privileged for a time to live in a garden of abundance. They had everything, not only they could possibly need, but everything they wanted. But they were still vulnerable to the temptation of the evil one to want the one thing that they were forbidden by God to have. They were vulnerable, in other words, to wanting to be like God rather than have to be subject to him and his law. Though it's not as seemingly simple as a fruit on a tree, this is the persistent temptation presented to human beings, to want to be like God rather than to have to be subject to him. We certainly see this writ large today as human beings try to wrongfully assert their own will above God's as revealed in his law. In particular, we as humans assert our right to have a say over even essential matters of life and death, which truly belong to God. Indeed, as people, we see that others kill others, or nations declare deadly wars against others, or states impose death penalties on criminals, or abortion is seen as an inviolable right, and euthanasia is slowly being sought and permitted almost everywhere. And now people assert their right to self-mutilate in order to change their God-given gender. Indeed, in these ways and more, human beings assert ourselves to be like God with authority over matters of life and death, rather than being subject to him who has true authority over those matters. In contrast to our first parents, and thus to all of us since, Jesus goes not into a garden, but a desert, voluntarily depriving himself of everything he actually needs. There, he is also tempted by the evil one to assert his will over that of his heavenly Father. But Jesus, unlike Adam and Eve, succeeds in resisting, and so reveals himself to be the one whose perfect obedience, even in the most difficult of situations, will be the antidote to human disobedience, even in the best of circumstances. Indeed, this will prepare Jesus well for his public ministry, a ministry in which he will have to forego his own need for comfort, his own need for food and rest, in order to spend himself completely as he preaches and teaches and heals in the limited time he has available to accomplish his mission. And it will prepare him well to submit to the most unreasonable demand of all, which is God's demand that he lay down his life completely by submitting to the great injustice of the cross. Indeed, we are saved by the perfect obedience of Jesus offered on that cross to our Heavenly Father, offered for us who try as we may end up disobeying. Yet we are given an example of how we might learn to say no to the evil one, and thus to ourselves more often, in order to unite ourselves with Jesus in saying yes to the Father and all that is pleasing to him. It is to do what we find Jesus himself doing in today's gospel, which is fasting and praying. Fasting is a way in which we learn to say no to ourselves by saying no to the food which our body is seemingly demanding we eat. Now, fasting is never self-starvation, but it's a plan of periodic deprivation in the midst of our abundance. According to the Church's law, it involves taking nothing more than the equivalent of one meal of food during a day. Fasting is legislated for us by the Church on only 2 days of the entire year, Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. But let us not forget that it is recommended to us much more frequently. Yes, we know that the early Christians fasted on every Wednesday and Friday every week. And the Church understands Lent as a season when we might revisit that commendable practice to make fasting more than just a weight loss strategy. It has to be accompanied by prayer, just as we see Jesus both fasting and praying in the desert for 40 days. While technically not fasting in the strict sense, still self-imposed avoidance of favorite foods or beverages or meals out at restaurants or other luxuries and pleasures during these 40 days are other forms of self-denial, ways of practicing that discipline of saying no to ourselves so that we can say no to the evil one and more readily say yes to God. And depriving ourselves of things we may want but do not need is ever more beneficial when it enables us to help the poor to acquire the necessities that they need to live with greater dignity. So almsgiving is always closely connected to fasting, self-denial, and prayer. So as the 40 days that Jesus spent in the desert prepared him to faithfully undertake his ministry and to ultimately obediently fulfill his mission, so should the 40 days of Lent be for us. Yet we must take Lent seriously if it is to have its intended effect. We have had the last few days since Ash Wednesday, in a sense, to practice, because these days are technically not Lent yet, but what is known as the porch of Lent. But now we are invited to cross over the threshold and enter Lent as we begin counting 40 until we will reach Holy Thursday, and on that evening enter the shortest but holiest and most important season of our year as Christians, the 3 days we call the Sacred Triduum. If we have died to ourselves through Lenten fasting and self-denial, then we will be prepared to celebrate Christ in his Passover from death to new life in that Easter Triduum. So we have to ask, what will the next 40 days be like for us? A time of fasting, self-denial, prayer, and sacrifice for those in need, which help us progress in our ability to imitate that perfect obedience and self-sacrificing love of Jesus Christ, which is actually divine life? Or will the next 40 days be not so different than any other days, and thus leave us unchanged and more vulnerable to the evil one's temptations for us to be self-assertive, self-centered, self-indulgent? The choice is ours, and the path we choose to walk for the next 40 days has to begin today. Ask any of us in the parish office. There were many among us last year for the first of Lent who are not with us now. They did not know it was going to be their final Lent. So let us treat this as if it might be our last Lent, and therefore let it be our best.